Every day like it was New Year's, I'm gonna open my eyes like it was the first time. Let this miracle of life bring me alive. I'm gonna dance every time that I hear the birds sing. Wanna fly just as high, Jah, give me the wings. I am infinite potential and all that it brings. Love of the universe, luminous beings. We are love of the universe, luminous beings. We are the love of the universe, luminous beings.
Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in here to the Bring Me to Life podcast. This is episode 104. It is part 2 of the Sacred Sexuality Series by Amara Amethyst. And today she's going to be talking about how limited sexual expression can be expanded to a powerful and balanced sexual expression. She also talks about how sexuality is one of the most powerful forms of self-actualization. Also, she wanted me to mention that she will be talking a lot about sexual trauma in this episode, but she is going to be telling you how you can take steps to transform that sexual trauma into bliss. So, thank you all for tuning in here to the Bring Me to Life podcast, and enjoy.
Greetings, dear ones. I'm Amara Amethyst, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, talking about sovereign sacred sexuality on the Project Bring Me to Life podcast. I hope you're all having a wonderful day wherever you are. And I just wanted to mention that we would love to hear your feedback about who's tuning in to this series. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have. So if you have a question that has come up from our first episode or during this episode, you can feel free to make a comment with that question, and I'll take a look at those and try to fit in some answers into our next episode. So this episode of the Sacred Sexuality Series is going to be about sexual empowerment and healing, and that's pretty exciting to me. I believe that we are all spiritual beings who are having human experiences, and that our sexuality is a huge part of this path of embodiment that we have chosen to be on. Sexuality can be a pleasurable, peaceful, and ecstatic aspect of our lives, regardless of how we have engaged with sexuality in the past or what we chose to accept about sex before. So that's a pretty amazing thing. No matter what our past experiences have been in terms of sexuality, or really with anything else, we have the power, when we are present and conscious and aware and focusing our energy and our intentions, we have the power to transform sexuality and every other aspect of our lives and how we engage with these things. So we're going to talk about some ways that we can move ourselves from a limited sexual expression to an expansive sexual expression. And many people who are on the planet right now have experienced some form of a negative encounter with sexuality or with the idea of sex, either through cultural, social, or religious programming, or through direct experiences that we have had, or through witnessing others who we know and love going through difficult experiences. And so it's important for us to be aware of that and to recognize that and to honor that part of our lives so that we can learn from it and move forward and really create the life that we are wanting to live. And for me, reclaiming my sexuality and reclaiming sex and the way that I engage with it has been a huge part of my personal journey in this lifetime, and also a huge part of my spiritual journey as well. we can reframe the beliefs and ideas that we have about sex. We can also sort of reprogram ourselves to act in different ways, to engage in different ways. Many of us may feel shame or have negative beliefs that we used to hold around the ideas of sex and sexuality. So I think it's important for us to see these things for what they are. There are a lot of structures that have been put in place to disempower people and to keep people small, scared, and out of touch with their true essential power. And these structures are can display as things like religious and social ideologies, so concepts that we have at some point chosen to believe. And for many of us, we didn't realize that we had a choice to choose to believe something different because we were only presented with one option during our formative years of growth, during childhood, during the times when we were coming of age. Many of us are only given access to certain stories, certain socially accepted or culturally accepted and agreed upon stories about what sexuality is and what different ways of expressing our sexuality mean. So I'm going to just list off different words that have been used to disempower people, really, in my opinion, and just allow you to feel and think about how you feel, and think about, what comes up for you when you hear these words. And then I'll list some other words that, and we'll just compare the two. So some of the things that we may have been told that are part of the dominant cultural narrative here in the Western world are ideas about marriage, fidelity, sin, being a virgin or being a slut, being a good girl, being a good boy, being a bad boy, heterosexuality, and homosexuality. So there's a lot that is packaged into these words. It's no longer just these single words. They come along with an entire weight of meaning that has been built up and added onto these seemingly simple concepts over hundreds of years. And it's been done on purpose, as we mentioned earlier, and as we also mentioned in the last episode, that these words have been really given a lot of extra power and meaning over time by other stories that are attached to them and what it means to be these things. For me, hearing some of these words leaves me feeling kind of heavier or smaller in some way. There are other words as well that I will list off, and you can see how you feel about these words as well. Orgasmic bliss, manifestation, actualization, divine union, sacred desire, holy partnership. These are some other ways that sexuality and certain types of sexual expression can be viewed. These words also have a lot of meaning behind them, And also they're kind of being reintroduced into the narrative of the Western culture as more and more people begin to reawaken and remember who we are. We are also remembering these really powerful ways that we can express and share our sacred sexual energy. This second list leaves me personally feeling expansive, excited, lighter, and I prefer those feelings to the other feelings from the first list. So I am focusing my energy and intention and actions towards this second list, this second way of being. And of course, there are many ways of being, and we're all on our perfect paths. This series is intended to be a place where information and ideas are shared, and some practices as well that I hope will assist each and every one of us on our journeys towards self-actualization, awakening, and living as fully embodied as we can. So, you may remember, if you tuned into our first episode of this series about sovereign sacred sexuality, that our sexual energy is the most powerful creative force that we have access to as humans. We can tap into this powerful force, cultivate or build it up, and use this energy to nurture our physical health, to grow spiritually, to connect more deeply with the divine or with the universe, and to deepen our relationships with others as well. Sexual energy is one of our most powerful tools of self-actualization. So we can see why certain structures and beings may wish to disconnect us from this if they wish to remain in control and power over us. We who are rising now are all about power with instead of power over. And so that's why we're sharing this information, because we are all divine beings, we're all powerful beings, and it's time for us to rise together. And we can transcend these old stories and belief systems. A good way to start doing that, in case you're wondering, is to ask yourself what you believe about sex and sexuality, and to really dig deep with this, because sometimes what we think we believe or what we want to believe isn't actually what we truly believe on a deep level. And we can do this by looking at our relationships with lovers and past lovers, past partners, current partners, and with ourselves, and by seeing how we were acting in these relationships, and also how based on how we were acting or interacting, we can then begin to dig deeper and see why am I acting this way, or why did I act this way? What belief did I have that led me to that action? And then we can ask ourselves, once we are seeing what our beliefs are, the next step is to ask, when did you choose to believe these stories? And then we can choose, if we want to begin to rewrite that story, to let go of these old stories that are not serving us and rewrite them with things that are serving us. Many human beings who are alive on the planet right now have some type of sexual issue or sexual trauma that we have experienced. It is possible for us to transcend this just in the same way that we can transcend old stories. We can heal and enjoy a rich and satisfying sexual life. In the next little section of this episode of the Sacred Sexuality podcast, we're going to spend a little bit of time unraveling sexual trauma and also talking about steps that we can take to transform trauma into bliss. And that sounds pretty good to me. I'd like to share a little bit of my personal story to give some reference for people as to why this is a passion of mine personally. I have been on a journey of sexual healing for almost 2 decades now. So that's a long time, almost 20 years. And when I was younger, when I was in high school, I experienced sexual assault. And that really affected me very deeply, even more deeply than I realized at the time, or even realized several years later. It's still unraveling, and I'm still in the process of self-healing and self-actualization through this work. So I had a couple of experiences when I was in high school with 2 different people who I thought were my friends, who did not respect my boundaries, and who sexually assaulted me, who raped me. And this was very painful when it happened physically, and also emotionally confusing and painful, and mentally confusing and painful. And then the reactions of the world around me, of the adults and even of my peers around me, was very hurtful as well. I didn't understand why. I felt shame around what happened personally on my own anyways, and I was afraid to tell anybody. And then when I did tell people, even more shame and blame was put on me by other people, of asking what I did to bring that on, for example, or not believing me, or telling me not to talk about it. And several of the people who told me not to talk about it, I believe that they believed that they were protecting me from being judged by other people. But really what that was doing was stifling my voice even more and reinforcing the fact that, the quote unquote fact, that I had done something wrong or something to deserve this, and that I was continuing to be punished for whatever that was. So this manifested in a lot of different ways for me. These were very traumatic events in my life, and it has taken me a really long time to feel comfortable in relationships with men. I identify as a cisgender female, so that means that I identify as a female, and I was also assigned the gender of female when I was born. And I'm also mostly heterosexual, which means that I am mostly attracted to the opposite sex, which in my case means that I'm mostly attracted to men. So for me, it felt really unsafe for a long time to interact with men. I didn't trust people. I wanted to trust people, and I wanted to interact with people, but I didn't really know what the right way to do that was, because these were some of my earliest sexual experiences. I also started to mistake sexual interaction for love, and I wanted to feel wanted. I wanted to feel accepted. I wanted to feel loved. And so I sought that out through sexual activity with people, which I feel that I would not have done otherwise if I had not had these other experiences beforehand. Physically, I had some PTSD responses. My trauma got triggered in certain situations, in relationships with partners who I cared about deeply. And I sometimes would just freak out in the middle of an intimate moment, and that caused more pain for both myself and my partner, and was pretty difficult to deal with at times. I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the ways that this trauma manifested physically for me. But right now, I'm going to share also that I have been very lucky to come across sacred sexuality and sexual healing from a sacred place. It has been completely life-changing for me, very empowering, and has really allowed me to balance myself internally, to love myself more, to feel comfortable and safe to express sexually with myself and with others. And I really highly recommend, if anybody out there who is listening to this has experienced sexual trauma in some form, I highly recommend not only talking to a professional like a therapist or somebody along those lines, to also, if you feel comfortable, to reach out and see if you can find a sacred sexual healing practitioner to work through some of these issues with. That has been completely life-changing for me. I work with a very powerful, I call it temple healer. I work with a very powerful temple healer who absolutely views sexuality as sacred and views me as a sacred being, and who has a lot of respect and love for me that I can feel. And working with him has been transformative for my life. So it is possible through self-healing and also through the support of others who love us, through supportive partners, through family members perhaps, or through professional help. It is entirely possible to change the course of our lives and the course of our relationships. And I am one example of that in action. And it's been an interesting journey so far, and I'm sure that there's a lot more to come. So just wanted to share that. That is why I personally, because of my own personal experience and because of my work with the Mobile Goddess Temple, I have a mobile sacred space that's called the Nectar of the Goddess Temple that I have traveled across the United States of America with. And in this space, oftentimes I'm approached by people, women and men alike, who share things, very deep and intimate things with me. And I've heard a lot of people sharing about their shame around sexuality, their confusion around sexuality, and trauma around sexuality as well. So if you or somebody you know has experienced any of these things, please know that you are absolutely not alone. And it's actually quite common for people to have experienced different versions of these things. And it's entirely possible for us to find friends, lovers, partners, and people to assist us who understand and who accept and love and celebrate us as we are, and who are not judging any of the things that we have experienced in the past, whether they were consensual or not. Okay, so as I was mentioning, many human beings who are alive on the planet, so many of us have experienced some type of sexual issue and may have had or still have trauma. And we can transform this trauma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that can cause sexual trauma, because it's not only physical assault that can cause these things. And there's a whole range of issues and trauma that people can experience. Some things that can cause this in people are by being caught, quote unquote, caught by a parent or a caretaker while masturbating at a young age, and being shamed for pleasuring ourselves, or being told that that's not appropriate to do, or anything along those lines. Also, Things like circumcision and genital mutilation can cause sexual trauma. Repeated religious or social shaming and blaming for sexual related expressions can cause some form of trauma. Also, seeing another person who you love and care about, like a parent, a family member, a close friend, or somebody you respect and care about, seeing somebody else go through something like that can really warp our views and the way that we connect with sexuality. And of course, it can also be caused by verbal, physical, or emotional assault. So there's lots of things that can cause this, and there are also a lot of ways that this trauma can be expressed in our bodies. The responses of trauma are varied and personal to whoever it is that they're manifesting through. They express differently in different people. So I'll just share a couple of potential ways that trauma can manifest in our lives. And I'm going to go more into detail about my own personal experience. Because if anybody's out there who has experienced this type of trauma, or if you are wondering if somebody that you are relating to has this kind of trauma, then there's a lot of resources out there available to us online. So I encourage you to do your own research and find this on your own, because as I said, it's different for different people. And so the list, can get quite long. So I'll just talk about a couple of things here. So some ways that trauma can manifest for people are feeling afraid, feeling very scared to interact with others, and feeling unsafe in general. Expressing themselves overly sexually or overtly sexually and mistaking sex for love, as I mentioned earlier. It can also manifest as painful sex or the inability to feel turned on or to experience orgasm. And for me personally, I have experienced a lack of sensation in certain parts of my yoni. So yoni is the Sanskrit word for vagina, and it means sacred space. So I prefer the word yoni to the word vagina. The word vagina to me has always sounded clinical and honestly kind of gross, which I could go down a whole rabbit hole about that, but I'll save that for another time. So I'm going to use the word yoni to talk about vagina. So I personally have experienced a lack of sensation in certain parts of my yoni, which made sex not as stimulating, not as pleasurable for me, and also made it very challenging for me to experience orgasm for years and years and years and years. And so that also affected other parts of my life as well. If I was in relationship with somebody, I would feel frustrated sometimes or unsatisfied. And so of course that just added some extra unnecessary tension to relationships that I have experienced in the past. Also, I mentioned earlier that I have had my sexual trauma be triggered during intimate moments with partners, and that caused a lot of issues as well in certain contexts. So these are very real issues that people are dealing with, and it's important for us to be aware of that, because somebody who we're interacting with may have this experience. And just like every other experience that we've ever had, trauma is stored in our bodies and can be expressed later, sometimes at unexpected times. If you've ever been to see a massage therapist, you may have heard the expression, the issues are in the tissues. And this means that memories of events, emotional and physical reactions, and I guess it's mostly emotional and physical reactions to these events are stored in the tissues of the body. And so they can come up later if those same areas are touched again. And one way of conducting sexual healing for ourselves or with a trusted practitioner is to stimulate the body tissues and allow ourselves to experience things that we may have repressed or that our body may have repressed because we couldn't handle it at the time when it happened. This is really deep work and very transformative, and it brings things up. So if this is something that you're thinking of doing, it's very important to do this, to create a safe and sacred healing container for yourself and to allow yourself enough time and space to process what comes up. So this is not the type of activity that you want to do right before you're about to go to a party or right before you're about to go to work or anything like that. One way of stimulating tissues to allow for healing to happen is referred to, since I'm a woman, I'm going to talk about it from my perspective, is referred to as yoni massage. There's also lingam massage. The lingam is a Sanskrit word that means wand of light, and it's the word for a penis in the Sanskrit language. So you can do yoni or lingam massage on yourself, on your partner, or receive this from a practitioner. And this can be very healing. And also, as I mentioned, it can be very intense. So I would recommend, if you're going to receive this type of work, to do it when perhaps right at the beginning of your weekend or when you have time to rest and integrate and really allow yourself to process the interaction. So, as I mentioned, some places that sexual trauma can be stored include the yoni and the lingam, or the vagina and penis. Other areas could be other parts of the body, other intimate parts of the body that may have been touched non-consensually or touched too roughly, or places where we were told to not touch ourselves. So these places can store this type of trauma. And sometimes this could be like the waist or stomach, the buttocks, parts of our legs, our neck, our faces. And sometimes when these are touched by other people or by ourselves, it can really bring up a trauma trigger response. I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma trigger responses. And I believe it's really important for people to have an awareness of what a trauma trigger response looks like so that we can recognize it in ourselves and also recognize it in others so that we can really hold space for ourselves and for others. I will also mention that a lot of people use the word triggered, especially in spiritual circles or awakening circles. And in my opinion, they're misusing the word triggered. What a lot of people will say, "Oh, he just said that and it really triggered me," when really what they mean to say is, "Oh, he just said that and I felt a charge." So there's a difference between a trauma trigger and feeling a charge. When we're recognizing that we feel a charge around something, what we're saying is, I'm recognizing that I'm having an uncomfortable or negative response to whatever the stimulus is. It's bringing up something that's moving with a lot of force. A trauma trigger is an entirely different thing. And somebody saying that they're triggered when they're actually talking about their trauma being triggered is a much bigger deal than somebody saying they're triggered, but they really mean that they have a charge coming up. A charge is something that it's possible to let go of in the moment very easily and move on from. And a trauma trigger is something that can be more likened to an anxiety attack or a panic attack, it's very serious. And for some people, it's very difficult to transition. It can feel very difficult to transition out of that in the moment. So let's talk a little bit about what a trauma trigger response is. When people are having their trauma triggered, they can feel completely unsafe and actually start to have an anxiety attack or a panic attack. So this can mean a change in their nervous system and their heart rate and their breathing. This can also, a trauma trigger response can also cause a change in their brain function where they're now in fight or flight or freeze mode, and their decision-making abilities are limited. Their cognitive processing abilities are limited. So they're not able to necessarily understand complex things that are being said to them or shown to them. They're in the place of more like a yes, no, fight, flight, safe or unsafe situation. That's how their experience of reality can be. Also, they can be a lot more reactive to things because it's very overwhelming. The sensory body, the nervous system gets highly activated. And so they can become more sensitive to touch and sound. They can become more sensitive to being in a large group of people. That can suddenly feel very overwhelming to people who are actively having their trauma triggered. So it's important. You can see how important it is for us to be able to recognize this in ourselves and in others. It can be very hard to recognize this in yourself. And sometimes if it's coming up in a loved one, it can also be a little confusing to be able to determine what's going on, because whatever triggered this, whatever happened that is creating this response could be something that's really obvious, or it could be not as obvious. And so sometimes it's a little bit hard to determine what's going on in the moment. So as with everything else, being present and aware in the moment is key to being able to determine when somebody is in this state of being. So it's important to be able to hold space also for somebody who is a loved one who is in a trauma-triggered state. I'd like to share a little bit about that. Rule number 1 for this is do not take it personally. I know this can feel very challenging in the moment when we are really desiring a deep connection with someone who we love. It can feel challenging to not take it personally. But their trauma-triggered response is coming to the surface, and you're the one who is there with them. This is a wonderful opportunity for you to deepen your relationship in a loving way with this person by holding space for them. And by holding space, I mean being present with this person, remaining calm and centered and grounded. So centering in your heart and grounding into the earth, and really holding that frequency, holding your frequency, holding a frequency of loving acceptance for yourself, and so that this other person who you're interacting with can also feel that, because they're going to be feeling very overwhelmed. Some other suggestions are take deep breaths and, as I mentioned, remain present in a state of loving acceptance. I also recommend speaking very clearly and in short sentences. Ask simple yes or no questions. So, for example, asking, "Do you want to go find a quiet space to sit down?" is much easier for somebody in a triggered state to understand and respond to than, for example, asking, what do you need right now? If you ask somebody who's in this state what they need, they probably won't be able to tell you what they need because they don't necessarily know what they need in that moment. So you can ask them, do you want to go find a quiet space to sit down? Do you want to drink some water? Do you want to wrap yourself up in this blanket? Do you want me to ask people to keep their voices down? Things like that will be more supportive than asking them to come up with something on their own. As I mentioned before, the brain shuts down partway when people are in this state. So those are some ways that we can support our loved ones when they're in that state, getting them to a quiet space. If it's possible to wrap them up in something like swaddling a baby, that can also be very comforting to somebody who's feeling this way. Just giving them a blanket and wrapping it around them and then having them hold it around themselves. Giving them space to breathe and be in their own space. Sometimes people want to be alone. Sometimes people are afraid to be alone. So we can choose to sit with a person in the same room and just share the space and not necessarily talk, but just share the space. Let them know you're there. Maybe check in with them every once in a while. There are other ways to create a safe space for yourself and loved ones who may have trauma when you are building a sexual relationship. So we're going to switch now to talking about connecting with people who may have trauma, or connecting with people when you may have trauma and you're not feeling that your PTSD or trauma is triggered. So it's one thing when the trauma is triggered, it's another thing when the trauma is not triggered, but it's still, it's still there. It's still part of your reality. We can create a safe space for sexual connection and expression. And we can do this by building intimacy with our potential partners in advance of sharing physically with them. So creating shared experiences together, having conversations, sharing about our hopes, dreams, our history. Perhaps meditating together or working out together. Just building up positive experiences with each other and allowing yourself enough time to get to know and trust the person or people who you are wishing to connect with sexually before connecting with them sexually. I highly, highly recommend doing this to everybody, and especially to people who may have experienced trauma in their past. Also, talking about your history with your partners in advance of any type of physical connection, or even sometimes in advance of a deeper, intimate verbal connection, can be really helpful. Just letting people know what your history is, where you're coming from, how it has affected you in the past, what you're excited for in the future, and ways that it's changing. But just really creating a space of open communication, and also creating a space of consent where you know that both people are really connecting because they care and are there to excitedly connect however you both want to connect, or however you both don't want to connect. And having it be okay to stop connecting at any point in time, or to transition into a different way of connecting at any point in time. I'd also like to share some healing techniques and practices and tips for people who may have experienced sexual trauma in their past. My number one tip is be gentle with yourself and your lovers. Be so gentle with yourself and your lovers because you deserve it, and so do they. Allow yourself enough time to heal and to unfold again. Sometimes that could be years. Sometimes that could be not that long. But just allow yourself however much time you feel like you need, and know that there's nothing wrong with you no matter how long it takes. Also, on the other hand, sometimes we can start to isolate ourselves and feel like we never want to reach out again. That's not what I'm suggesting. So be willing to be brave enough to try again with a friend, by talking with them, with a therapist, by talking with them, with a healer, or with a trusted partner or partners. Some of my favorite practices for just becoming more in touch with my body and moving through my own blockages have been breathing exercises with energetic awareness, and also working with and moving my own sexual energy with awareness. So we can all do a practice of cycling energy that is called the microcosmic orbit. If you're already familiar with that practice, you can use that practice on its own, or you can also mix sexual energy and cycle the sexual energy through the microcosmic orbit. So you can energetically stimulate yourself, you can physically stimulate yourself to build up sexual energy, and then circulate it through your body, moving into your body and up at the perineum, which is right at the base of the spine between the genitals and the anus, and just move it, cycle it upwards. You can imagine or visualize the energy moving upwards, or if you feel energy, you can feel it. Intend for it to move upwards through the central channel of your body, up the back body, all the way up your spine and over the crown of your head, and then down the front body and all the way down to a space that is called the lower dantian. And this space is located between your navel and genitals. So it's at the womb or the hara. And you can empty out the energy into this space, and then continue to draw more energy up the back body, through the perineum, up the back body, over the top of your head, down your front body, and empty it into the lower dantian. And this will not only move a lot of energy throughout your whole system, but it also, by putting the energy into the lower dantian area, we're replenishing our energy stores. And this will help us not just sexually, but in all parts of our life. So that's one little exercise that you can do by yourself, or you can do this exercise simultaneously with a partner or partners. You can also, so that's a really nice exercises. I also enjoy sensual, sexual, and erotic touch, doing that for myself, and also with trusted partners or healers or friends, if you have friends who you feel comfortable sharing that way with. So just creating a really yummy, safe, sacred bubble, a space, a physical space where you feel safe and you feel like you will not be interrupted for a period of time to explore these practices in. Other things that have been very helpful for me along the way are reframing the goals of sexual interactions. For example, your goal does not have to be reaching orgasm every time you have sex or engage in a sexual encounter. Your goal can be sharing a sensual experience. It can be connecting with yourself and or with a loved one. It can be exploring sensations in a certain part of your body, and so on and so forth. Your goal can be anything you can think of. It's really fun. It doesn't have to be limited to any particular thing. So those are some of my my favorite practices and tips. One other thing that I would really like to, well, a couple of other things that I would like to mention that are, I guess, more so words of encouragement, are just a reminder that transformation of any kind, but transformation like changing trauma into a pleasurable expression of sexuality, is a spiral path. So it's not a linear path. It's not always moving forward in the same direction. It's a spiral path, which means that we are likely to end up revisiting similar or even the same issues more than once. And this is okay. This is how we learn and grow as spiritual beings having a human experience. I'd also love to share something that I have learned along the way during my own journey of sexual healing. This has helped me so much that I just love to share it with other people as well. So, this particular insight has come to me through a guide and a being who I feel very devoted to and have been working with for several years. She is known by many names, and perhaps the most well-known of these names is Mary Magdalene. One thing that I have learned from my years of receiving sexual healing support from other practitioners and sacred sexual healing, which I mentioned earlier, I call it temple healing because it can include several different modalities and also different traditions. So I refer to it, I kind of lump it together under the title of temple healing. So this thing that I've learned from exploring sexual healing on my own and with others is something that she has taught me how to do again, because I did not have this experience the first time around during my sexual journey. I didn't learn it the first time, or as I was learning about sexuality. She shared with me the importance of truly letting go and relaxing during sensual and sexual experiences. The ability to do this, to let go, can feel challenging to those who have experienced sexual trauma. We can let go and relax during sexual encounters, and this will allow us to enjoy deeper, more satisfying sensations, to connect more authentically with our partners. That is to say, we can connect with more presence and more fully and deeply with our partners. And also it allows us to more fully connect with the divine energies available to us during these ecstatic sexual states. Because these are very elevated states of being that we get into. We can raise our frequency and vibration through sexual expression. What she shared with me to help me let go and allow, and which has also been immensely helpful to the others who I've shared this insight with over the years, was when you feel safe enough or when you have faith enough, you can truly let go. When you feel safe enough or when you have faith enough, you can truly let go. So let's break this down a little bit, because it sounds pretty straightforward, but there's actually a lot to it. The first part is when you feel safe enough, you can truly let go. Seems pretty straightforward. When we are present in the moment and in our bodies during sexual experiences. So I say that because some people have a tendency, especially people who have experienced some sort of sexual abuse, some people have the tendency to leave their bodies during sexual experiences. So their body is still there and their awareness has moved up and a little bit outside of their body. So some people have an experience of watching themselves in sexual encounters, or sometimes they're just not feeling things as much, or they're not able to stay as present. They're thinking about other things. So when we're able to be present in the moment and also in our bodies during sexual experiences, then we can be aware of whether or not we're feeling safe. Sometimes in the past, I have felt unsafe to open myself up because, as I mentioned, I too have experienced sexual assault. And that created a lot of trauma in my body, mind, emotional body, and energy field that made it feel like a really big challenge to relax and let go. This resulted, as I mentioned, in a number of different things, including an inability for a long time to experience orgasm, and also shutting down sometimes when I was interacting sexually with myself or others. Both of those also led to feelings of frustration and being unsatisfied. So a lot of extra tension in my life because I couldn't relax and let go, because I didn't feel safe. More recently, I've been able to allow myself to choose to feel safe, to know that I am safe, because I've been choosing to interact only with trustworthy partners who honor and love me, and who have proven this to me through our past interactions. These are people who are there to support me if I choose to say no, or if I choose to say yes, or anything in between and beyond. This is possible for each and every one of us. So that's the first part, when you feel safe enough. Also, if I don't feel safe enough in a particular moment, then I can choose the second option, which is choosing to have faith enough. If you believe in a higher power, or the goddess, or God, or ascended masters or angels, or your higher self or the universe, your ancestors, or whatever it is that you believe in, you probably do believe that there is some greater force at play behind all of our experiences of life if you're tuning into this podcast series. Or you're at least open to considering the idea that there's something greater than yourself out there. So, if that is true for us, if we believe in some divine being or higher power or the universe, this means that we can choose to have faith in whatever it is that we choose to believe in. For me, that's the goddess. So I can choose, if I don't feel safe enough, to believe, to have faith that the goddess loves me and is supporting me, and that I'm fully protected. Then that faith allows me to let go and experience what is in the present moment. And oftentimes, what is in the present moment leads to blissful and ecstatic states when it comes to sexual experience, higher levels of consciousness, and more embodied understanding of profound insights about reality. So, I invite you to use this guiding statement when you feel safe enough, or when you have faith enough, you can truly let go. So if you've ever felt like it was a challenge for you to truly surrender and let go, and truly allow waves of bliss and orgasm and ecstasy and connection to wash over your body and through your energy field, if you've ever felt challenged in that before, I invite you to explore using this statement. And you can also use affirmations like, I am safe, or I have faith. I, in the past, have used affirmations during sexual healing and during sexual encounters as well, internally. And then actually a couple times I externally was saying affirmations. I am safe. The goddess holds me in her arms. I am safe, while I was receiving sexual healing, and I felt a little scared. So using affirmations is so helpful in all aspects of our lives, including sexuality. And there's just so many ways for us to explore and transform ourselves in this lifetime. So let me know what you think about this statement. When you feel safe enough, or when you have faith enough, you can truly let go. I'd also love to hear if any of you out there have your own tricks or tips or suggestions for sexual healing and empowerment. What practices have worked for you? Or what practices have you heard about that you may have a question about? Because as I mentioned before, I've been researching sacred sexuality and sexual healing and empowerment for a couple of decades now. And I've also studied with several teachers and have shared sexual healing work with others as well. So I'd be happy to hear what your questions are and see what your comments are and see how we can continue to support each other on our process. Thank you so much to all of you for tuning into this episode of the Sovereign Sacred Sexuality podcast here on Project Bring Me to Life Radio. I'm really looking forward to our next episode, which will be about the different types of different flavors of sacred sexuality, different teachings from around the world. We'll be doing a brief introduction to a lot of different practices and traditions that have been in use for thousands of years. So until then, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments, and also try some of these practices like the microcosmic orbit and using the statements and affirmations. So much love and many blessings to all of you.
Thanks for shining on with us.